Get ready to stretch your minds, folks, because today we're taking a deep dive into something unexpected: religion.
Yeah, you heard that right. Religion.
But before you hit that skip button thinking this is another sermon, I promise you this is different.
We're tackling religion from a whole new angle.
We're joining forces with, get this, a philosopher of science,
Michel Serres,
to explore religion as this, hidden force that shapes who we are, our history, our societies, even our personal connections. Wild, right?
What makes Serres so fascinating is he's not coming at this from a, preachy perspective. He's looking at religion as this invisible structure, almost like a force of gravity that's been impacting human experience since, forever.
It's true. And our guidebook for this deep dive is Serres' The Religion, Rereading What Is Bound Together. Full disclosure, the book is, let's just say it's a thinker.
Dense.
But lucky for you, you've got us to break it down.
We'll be your translators, your guides through Serres' most mind-blowing ideas.
Exactly. And one of the coolest things Serres does is he defines religion as this force of binding.
And it's a two-way street.
Oh, tell me more about that.
It's this vertical binding, connecting us upward to something much bigger than ourselves.
Okay.
And at the same time, this horizontal binding.
Right.
Tying us to each other, creating communities, societies.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's unpack this whole binding thing, starting with the vertical. Serres uses this term, hotspots, to describe these moments in history where seemingly totally random, unrelated realms collide. And boom, they spark massive innovation or change.
It's like, those moments in superhero movies, two beams of energy meet and suddenly there's this explosion of something totally new.
Yes, a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And he connects these hotspots with, the biggest breakthroughs that have defined civilization, like Galileo's trial.
Right. We tend to see that as pure conflict, right? Science versus religion. But Serres, he argues it was actually a hotspot where abstract math collided head-on with what everyone thought was reality, the physical world. And that collision changed how we understand the universe forever.
So it's less about faith versus reason and more about these, cosmic fender benders that create ripples throughout history.
Exactly.
Even the invention of money was a hot spot.
Right.
It's not like humans dug up some gold and were like, aha.
Yeah.
Currency. It fundamentally changed how we value things.
Yeah.
How we exchange goods. Everything.
Exactly. And think about the alphabet.
Oh, wow.
Those little symbols we take for granted, totally revolutionary hotspot, the ability to preserve knowledge, transmitted across time and space. Imagine a world without written language.
It's mind-blowing. And here's where things get really interesting. Serres argues that the birth of major religions, Christianity, for example, were also hotspots. Moments where the earthly and the divine collided in a big way.
Big way is an understatement. He uses the story of the three wise men as a prime example. Now, we've all heard the story a million times, but Serres wants us to look beyond the nativity scene and see something much deeper. Each gift those wise men bring represents a whole realm of power colliding in the most ordinary of settings.
Okay, I'm with you. So we've got gold, obviously, always a symbol of wealth and power, earthly power. But what about frankincense and myrrh? Those were always kind of a mystery to me.
Right. So frankincense, think about that aromatic smoke rising up. It was all about religious ceremony, connecting with the heavens, the divine, myrrh. Now that was used in embalming and healing.
Oh, interesting.
So it represents scientific knowledge, our very human attempt to understand and even cheat death.
Whoa. So you have these three major forces, these kings in their own right, bowing down to a baby, a symbol of ultimate vulnerability. It's a powerful image.
Exactly. This seemingly insignificant infant becomes the hotspot, the focal point where these massive forces converge and change the course of history.
It really makes you think about those seemingly small moments in our own lives, doesn't it? A chance encounter, a book we read, maybe even a conversation like this one. Any one of them could be a hotspot with the power to change everything.
Absolutely. Serres was really tuned in to the tension within religious narratives. Another example he points to the Immaculate Conception. Now, this wasn't just about Mary's purity. It was about a woman existing outside the power structure, challenging the whole system.
So even within religious doctrine, those hot spots, those clashes between old and new, they keep happening.
Exactly. And that tension, that push and pull, is something Serres traces throughout history. How do we navigate those forces? Do we cling to the old or embrace the new?
It's a lot to unpack. But before we move on to how this binding force plays out in our own personal connections, how it ties us to each other, let's take a second to let all of that simmer. Okay, so we've explored those explosive hotspots where the heavens and the earth collide, but what about that horizontal binding? How does religion, this invisible force, tie us to each other?
Well, Serres, he doesn't shy away from the darker side of connection. He says even our darkest impulses can be a strange form of binding.
Oh, okay, how so?
He points to a rather unsettling example, our fascination with violence and death.
That took a turn. But I see what you mean. Like, historically, you had public executions, people flocked to those. And today, I mean, just turn on the news, it's a 247 cycle of tragedy. Why are we drawn to these things, even though they horrify us? It's strange.
Serres argues it's primal, almost like this macabre ballet. We become bound together through shared shock and horror.
So it's like we need those moments, even if they're terrifying, to remind us that we're part of something larger than ourselves. It's unsettling, but I think there's some truth to that.
Think about ancient sacrifices. They weren't just about appeasing the gods. They were carefully orchestrated rituals, bringing the community together through a shared experience.
Right. A very visceral shared experience.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be a public spectacle, right? Because Serres, he finds this same dynamic playing out on a smaller, more personal scale in one of the Bible's most famous stories, Peter's denial of Christ.
Exactly. You have Peter absolutely terrified, denying he even knows Jesus. Not once, but 3 times.
It's brutal.
A deep betrayal. But Serres, he focuses on what happens next. Peter is consumed by guilt, weeping bitterly.
We've all been there. That gut-wrenching feeling when you've let someone down.
Yeah.
Or haven't lived up to your own standards. It's awful.
And that's where the horizontal binding kicks in. Serres argues that acknowledging our failings, seeking forgiveness, reconciling, it's all essential to strengthening social bonds.
It's like not about being perfect, but how we deal with our imperfections, how we choose to come back together.
Exactly. It's counterintuitive. We think strength comes from hiding our flaws, but Serres suggests it's the opposite. Admitting our weaknesses, our need for forgiveness, that's what actually weaves us more tightly into the social fabric.
It's like the opposite of what we're told to do, right?
Yeah.
Put on a brave face, pretend everything's fine, but that just creates more distance, more isolation.
And you can see this playing out in how we approach death, in how funerals have evolved. Think about how technology has transformed grieving. Televised funerals, social media tributes. It's a new kind of collective experience.
That's so true. I remember watching Nelson Mandela's funeral, and even though I was thousands of miles away, I felt this wave of shared grief and respect. It's like technology allows us to mourn globally.
Exactly. Serres saw this shift from physical presence to this virtual connection as central to understanding how religion, even death, is experienced in the modern world. But it does make you wonder, are we more connected or more alone?
Right. We might be more digitally connected than ever before, but are we truly bound in a meaningful way?
It's a crucial question, but Serres doesn't leave us in despair. He sees a more hopeful side to this horizontal binding, a force that transcends even death, and that force is love.
Okay, from public executions to love. Now, I'm really intrigued. Where does he go with this?
He starts with a rather unexpected example, the Holy Family. Now remember, Serres loves to challenge assumptions. He doesn't see the Holy Family as simply a biological unit, but as a radical blueprint for a different kind of kinship.
Wait, you're saying Joseph, Mary, and Jesus weren't your typical family? I mean, I know the whole virgin birth thing is a bit unusual, but...
Think about it. Jesus, the Son of God, conceived through the Holy Spirit. Joseph, his guardian, but not his biological father. And Mary's virginity, whether you take that literally or metaphorically, further complicates those traditional family structures.
Okay, so how does this all relate to binding?
Serres argues that the Holy Family represents chosen kinship. Relationships defined not by blood, but by love. And that was a radical idea back then, and you could argue it's just as radical today. It challenges us to consider the boundaries we place on love and family.
So he's pushing us beyond the traditional definition of family, suggesting we can choose who we consider our closest kin.
Precisely. And he sees this reflected in the act of adoption, a deliberate choice to extend love and create lasting bonds outside of bloodlines. It's a powerful message in a world that's so often fragmented by our differences.
It really is. It suggests that love, in its purest form, has this incredible power to bind us together, creating families not necessarily bound by blood, but by shared values, experiences, commitment.
And that brings us to one of the most challenging questions humanity grapples with, one where both vertical and horizontal binding converge. the problem of evil.
Now we're really getting into the deep end. Where does Serres even begin to unpack something so heavy?
He starts by tracing the evolution of sacrifice throughout religious history, beginning with, well, the most extreme form, human sacrifice.
It's a tough subject. But it makes sense, right? These ancient cultures believed in appeasing the gods through these offerings, hopefully ensuring a good harvest or victory in battle.
Exactly. Then we see a shift from human to animal sacrifice. Think of the Israelites with their very structured system of offerings. It's still a life taken, but there's a growing distance between the sacrificer and the sacrifice.
And then finally, you arrive at the symbolic sacrifice in the Eucharist, the bread and wine, representing Christ's body and blood. It's like we've moved from literal bloodshed to this symbolic act of remembrance and communion.
That's Serres' point. He wants us to see how our understanding of sacrifice has evolved, becoming more internal, more focused on spiritual transformation. But that still leaves us with the question, can we ever truly escape the cycle of violence?
It's a question that has haunted humanity for centuries. Does Serres offer any answers? Or is it just, a hopeless cycle?
He doesn't exactly offer easy answers, let's put it that way. But he brings in another fascinating thinker, René Girard, and his scapegoat theory. Girard argued that societies often channel their diffuse violence onto a single victim. This act of scapegoating provides temporary order, but ultimately the cycle of violence repeats itself.
So no matter how far we evolve, we might be hardwired for this cycle of blame and violence. It's kind of a depressing thought, isn't it?
It's definitely something to grapple with. But Serres, he challenges us to look for those ways to cultivate the connections that foster understanding and compassion, rather than division and violence. It's in those genuine moments of human connection, empathy, and forgiveness that he sees the potential for lasting change.
It's a lot to digest. We've gone from the grand sweep of history to the very personal experience of guilt and forgiveness. But I have to say, I feel like my understanding of religion is shifting. It's less about dogma and more about these invisible forces that connect us all, for better or for worse. All right, so we've been on this incredible journey through Michel Serres' ideas about binding, these unseen forces that connect us not just to each other, but to something way bigger than ourselves. But before we wrap up, there's one more thread I really want to pull on. It's this fascinating connection Serres makes between the city and the countryside.
Yeah, this is where Serres' own life really plays into his thinking. Unlike a lot of academics, content in their ivory towers, Serres, he spent a good chunk of his life outside those urban centers. And he was really struck by how differently people experience the world depending on where they lived.
It's like when we talk about the hustle and bustle of city life, right? Versus the peace and quiet of the countryside. But Serres, he saw something deeper going on, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He felt like city dwellers, surrounded by concrete and technology. We tend to see ourselves as separate from nature, almost like above it, Like we've conquered our environment, so we don't have to answer to it anymore.
I get that. When you're surrounded by skyscrapers and subways, it's easy to forget we're still part of the natural world, subject to its, everything. The seasons, the storms. We're not as in control as we like to think we are.
Exactly. But for people who live in rural areas, farmers, fishermen, anyone who works directly with nature, there's this understanding, this deep in their bones knowledge that we're totally dependent on the natural world. They see firsthand how we're woven into the cycles of life and death, the changing seasons. They witness the raw power of nature every day.
So our physical surroundings, they actually shape how we see the world. Our whole worldview. It's not just about where we live. It's about how we live in those spaces, how connected we are or aren't to the natural world.
And he takes it even further, connecting this to how we experience religion. Serres argues that people living close to nature, they often have a more direct experience of the transcendent, less filtered.
It's like they see the divine in the everyday miracles of nature, right? A stunning sunset, the sheer power of a storm, the intricate balance of life in a forest. They don't need fancy rituals or dogma to feel connected to something bigger than themselves.
That's what's so cool about Serres' thinking. He's always drawing these unexpected connections. And he even sees this reflected in the Gospels, in the stories about Jesus.
Really? How so?
Think about it, all that nature imagery, those parables about farmers and fishermen, even the Sermon on the Mount delivered outdoors under an open sky.
It's true. It's hard to picture Jesus dropping those truths in some stuffy room.
Yeah.
It was a message rooted in the natural world, meant for everyone.
Exactly. But then, as Christianity spreads, St. Paul brings it to the cities, and things start to, shift.
It's like this message that was born in the countryside, rooted in this raw experience of nature, becomes more, codified. institutionalized maybe as it moves into those urban centers.
Exactly. And it's not that Serres is criticizing this change. He's just pointing out that as we move further away from nature, physically, mentally, you name it, our experience of faith, of spirituality, it inevitably changes.
It makes you wonder, can we bridge that gap? Can we hold on to that connection with nature even as we build our cities and our civilizations? Can we find that balance?
That's the challenge, right? And it's not just about religion either. It's about rediscovering a sense of wonder in our everyday lives, finding those moments of awe and connection, not just in temples or cathedrals, but in a walk through the park or looking up at the stars.
It's about tapping back into that childlike sense of wonder, that feeling of being connected to something so much bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
And speaking of connection, you mentioned earlier that Serres also explores the idea of dwelling. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, for Serres, dwelling wasn't just about having a roof over your head. It's about feeling this deep sense of belonging, of being rooted, both physically and spiritually. And he saw religion as playing a huge part in creating that feeling of dwelling.
So it's about more than just buildings, more than just churches and temples, right? It's about the communities they foster, the shared rituals, those beliefs that bind us together, connect us to something that transcends our individual lives.
Precisely. Serres believed that religion could provide a kind of home for the soul, a place to find meaning and purpose and, connection. He even draws this fascinating parallel between, get this, the structure of a cathedral and the concept of the Eucharist.
Okay, now that's an interesting comparison. Cathedrals and the Eucharist. How on earth did he connect those two?
He says both are designed to, in a way, contain and focus the divine presence, each in their own unique way. Think about what it feels like to step inside a cathedral. Those soaring arches, the light streaming through the stained glass, all those intricate details. It creates this sense of awe. It draws your gaze upward, heavenward.
It's like the architecture itself is designed to transport you, to lift you out of the ordinary and into this other realm, something sacred and transcendent.
Exactly. And the Eucharist, while much simpler, it aims to do something similar. It's believed to contain the actual body and blood of Christ, making the divine presence tangible, accessible to believers.
So both, in a way, are trying to bring the infinite into the finite, the transcendent into our everyday experience, whether it's through grand arches or the sharing of bread and wine. It's about making the divine feel close, present in our lives.
And that, I think, is really at the heart of it all. We long for that connection, for a sense of belonging, a home in this vast and often overwhelming universe. And whether we find that through religion, through art, through nature, through human connection, that search for meaning and belonging, it's something that unites us all.
That's a beautiful thought. And it brings us right back to Serres' main idea, this concept of binding. Whether it's the binding of ideas in those hot spots that change the course of history, or the binding of communities through rituals and beliefs, or even the binding of our souls to something larger than ourselves, Serres wants us to see the world as this web of interconnectedness, to see the invisible threads that tie us all together.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive, from the invention of money to the problem of evil, from the awe-inspiring power of cathedrals to the quiet solace of dwelling in nature. It's been quite a journey.
It really has. Michel Serres, with his unique perspective, he's given us a whole new way to think about religion, not just as a set of rules or doctrines, but as this powerful force that has shaped us, our history, our societies, and how we understand ourselves.
He pushes us to look deeper, to question what we think we know, and to find meaning in the most unexpected places.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this thought. In a world that so often feels divided, disconnected, maybe the most important question we can ask ourselves is, what binds us together? What are those threads that connect us to each other, to something larger than ourselves? Those are questions worth pondering, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Questions worth wrestling with.
Well said. And on that note, until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking those connections that make us human.